Hello everyone, I am Ben with the BTC Sessions. I am somewhere in southern Ontario on the road, actually just outside of Barrie, and today I'd like to talk to you about Bitcoin versus governments, namely how government regulation affects Bitcoin and vice versa. Getting into this, I see kind of three main approaches that governments can take. One is a friendly approach where they're very hands-off and essentially let Bitcoin grow on its own, or even encourage Bitcoin businesses to come to their country. Another is more of a regulate and integrate approach. And the third, of course, is a let's ban everything approach. Let's take a look at which countries have gone different routes and contrast, compare, and see what the effect has been. Alright, so let's start with some of the friendlier approaches. Taking a look at, for instance, the Isle of Man, they have decided not only to take a hands-off approach as far as most regulation, but they are actively encouraging and campaigning for Bitcoin and blockchain related companies to come there and set up shop. The idea is that if they have a light touch with regulation and they allow for this kind of innovation, then they are going to be a country on the bleeding edge of new technology, and they're going to have a step up on every other country in the world. Also, Canada, where I'm from, I feel has also had a very friendly approach to Bitcoin. We actually had Andreas Antonopoulos, who in my opinion is one of the best speakers in the space, come and talk to our Senate about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. After the exchange, the Senate was exceedingly pleased with what they heard, and they came to the decision that they would take a very hands-off approach and not introduce any regulation for at least a few years to come, so that they wouldn't stifle any innovation in this new area of technology. Now, that's not to say it isn't still difficult to deal with certain aspects of Bitcoin in Canada. And that mostly comes from the banks. If you are a Bitcoin company in Canada, you can have a hell of a time getting yourself banking. But again, that's not government, those are banks. Now, I can't speak to what it's like in the Isle of Man, but here at home in Canada, this, in my view, has led to a burst of activity as far as Bitcoin companies are concerned. In my city of Calgary at home, last year, around the beginning of summer, I believe there were about 5 or 6 Bitcoin ATMs in Calgary. And when I returned from my travels around December, I believe there were between 16 and 20. So it's growing quite quickly. There are 3 Bitcoin businesses where I'm from that I can think of, and I hear of a lot of startups happening in Vancouver and Toronto, all over the country. So I think it's a very positive thing, and it leads to companies wanting to be in Canada. Let's move down the line to governments that are taking a regulate and integrate approach. And the first case study I'd like to look at is Japan. Now, Japan is a little bit more on the friendly regulation side of things. They, just this past April, announced that Bitcoin would be a legal form of payment. They introduced anti-money laundering and know your customer laws, capital requirements for exchanges, and so on and so forth, and a licensing process. Now, with that regulatory certainty, you've seen a massive number of Japanese Bitcoin exchanges start to pop up. The volume in Japan has been going through the roof, and you have major retailers like BIC Cameras, I believe it is, start to accept Bitcoin as payment. So a lot of positives coming out of Japan because they're quick to get those regulations through and then let it grow from there. Still on the regulate-friendly side of things, you have the US that's leaning a little bit more towards the cautious and regulation-happy side of things. So you still have massive companies like Coinbase and BitPay based out of the US, but then you have regulations done on a state-by-state basis. And this can lead to uncertainty and a lot of different regulation loopholes to dive through in order to be available in every US state. In fact, you have places like New York where they have the Bit license and it's actually pushing companies out. We had Shapeshift leave New York State because they didn't agree with the over-regulation and the amount of capital required just to obtain said license. So while the US, because of the size of its economy, is a place where you're going to see a lot of Bitcoin growth, they could be regulating themselves into a corner in the future. Now, what about the unfriendly, ban-happy countries? Let's take a look at Venezuela. This is a place where you have a government that has devalued the currency so much that they're in a state of hyperinflation, where people's savings are eroded overnight and they find that they can't even afford groceries with them. Because of this, they are turning to things, alternatives, like Bitcoin. Now, in Venezuela, their electricity is heavily subsidized, which means you could feasibly be mining Bitcoin, getting your own much more stable currency, and using that in sort of a black market to buy goods overseas and have them smuggled into the country. And this is exactly what's happening. Now, looking at this, I've come to the conclusion that usually the countries that are the most likely to ban Bitcoin are the ones that are most threatened by it and have the most to lose. And we've seen instances of people who have been mining Bitcoin being arrested and jailed. So I think that speaks to the insecurity of the Venezuelan government and the fact that they recognize what a threat Bitcoin is to everything that they're doing. Finally, let's address the elephant in the room, and that is China. China has been infamous for banning Bitcoin on multiple occasions. In fact, the 2013 bubble was essentially popped by rumors and then supposedly confirmed reports of Bitcoin being banned in China. We quickly found out this wasn't the case, but it did propel us, amongst other things, into a 2-year bear market in the crypto space. Well, China has been at it a lot over the past few years, but they did finally pull the trigger and introduce very strict regulations, and not fully ban it, but it was enough to have major Bitcoin exchanges essentially shut down in China. Now, they probably won't be shut down forever, but each one is going to need a new license. That's going to take some time. Effective by October 30th, just about every exchange in China should be shut down. The thing with China doing this over and over again is that they can only do it once. Clearly, the People's Bank of China is threatened by Bitcoin. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be thinking about it or bothering with regulation. So I believe what we've seen over the past few years is them realizing that they cannot fully ban Bitcoin, but they do have a certain amount of ammo where they can issue these threats and tighten regulation and spook the market every time they do so. Over time, this will have less and less effect. And what we've seen this time around is one of the worst case scenarios. And we did see a massive pullback in the Bitcoin price, but not nearly as much as many would have expected. Sure, we dropped 30-something%, but Bitcoin went just below 3 grand and then rebounded like crazy and is now up in the 3,800s, which is unbelievable considering we started the year at around $1,000. The thing that I found most interesting about the bans in China this time around was something that Richard Hart mentioned as he was doing a show on the World Crypto Network. And if you haven't checked out Richard Hart's stuff so far, I highly recommend it. I'll put a link down below. What Richard was mentioning was the fact that they didn't just come out and say that all the Bitcoin exchanges were going to be closed down. The announcements were staggered. So the People's Bank of China would talk to each exchange and then they would come out and announce it. Well, why would you do something like this? Well, he made the comparison of these releases to what WikiLeaks would do. What WikiLeaks does is when they have a major leak, they'll gradually release information so as to have the most media impact. So instead of releasing everything all at once so the information is overwhelming, why not drop tidbits here and there so that it keeps on being picked up in the news? Not only did the Chinese stagger the announcement of each subsequent exchange being shut down, when the price didn't tank that much, now we're starting to see rumors of China banning Bitcoin transactions, which by and large is impossible. We'll get into that in a moment. I think the most important point to consider here is once you ban Bitcoin, you can't do it again. You've played all of your cards. All of this kind of makes me wonder when governments will start to realize that if you ban Bitcoin, you will be left behind. In fact, these bans only serve to highlight your lack of control. If you don't allow exchanges, well, then people resort to peer-to-peer methods, much like in China, when there were regulations on the exchanges introduced or a threat of them shutting down. Well, what did people do? They went to localbitcoins.com and volume shot through the roof. And guess what? With these subsequent bans that are happening now, you're gonna probably start to see people put way more work into peer-to-peer decentralized exchanges. If you try to block transactions outright through a firewall, well, people are gonna start looking at VPNs, people are gonna start looking at how to send Bitcoin via SMS, and people are gonna start looking at the Blockstream satellites that are in orbit now and maybe utilizing them. Point is, every time that you introduce something like this, Bitcoin gets vaccinated from future attacks that are similar. Everything that I've seen in the space over the past 4 years since I've been involved has led me to believe the following. Bitcoin will endure, Bitcoin will adapt, and Bitcoin will continue to grow. HODL, my friends. Bitcoin finds a way.
Life finds a way.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe, share this video, and drop a tip if you're able to. If you'd like to support the show in another way, check out my affiliate links down below for the Trezor and the Ledger. They are both awesome and kick-ass hardware wallets. Thanks again, and I will see you guys next time on the BTC Sessions.
Brighter than the sun.